Bye.
Okay. Great. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Laurie Moskowitz. I'm your moderator for this morning. I'm going to give a little bit of history on myself in a minute. I know we have a lot that we're going to try and cram into this session this morning. So bear with us as we work through this, because we're really trying to do this much more as a workshop rather than sort of just a talking at you opportunity. And I think it's really amazing that we're talking about engaging in civic engagement right after the Waging Democracy session. I think it's a really nice lead-in because we're going to go from sort of the big picture to actually the tactical. And I know that many of you in this room, have practicing this every day out around the country. And so this is really an opportunity to both learn from some of your colleagues that I have up here, and then also when we are going to do an exercise at the end and hopefully learn from each other and bring it all back together. So anyways, as I said, my name is Laurie Moskowitz. I'm a longtime political organizer, primarily in the political space, both with a lot of nonprofits, a lot of democratic political campaigns. I worked for 7 years at an NGO which practiced what we called aggressive bipartisanship, like the One campaign. A lot of people know it because we did work on ending global poverty. It was kind of founded by this rock star guy named Bono. And then I've also had my own firm doing grassroots organizing. So I come to this session sort of as and quite frankly, I'm very heavily involved in the Jewish community here in DC as well. But I sort of come to this session today as sort of a lifelong practitioner of civic engagement. I'll give you just a few stories just to give you some context for myself. I won my first election at the age of 6. It was the Miss Independence contest in Crofton, Maryland. It was very effective. I went door to door. It was awesome. I got a crown. I then moved to California with my parents, and I protested at the Soviet embassy in San Francisco, to release Soviet Jewry when I was 12 years old. I then went to college and registered voters and got involved in politics. And my first foray was actually in the nonprofit space, doing environmental organizing, and I literally switched out of electoral organizing when I decided that losing really important issues by 1 or 2 votes was not where I wanted to be, and so I went to electoral politics. And I have used all of these sort of elements to kind of guide myself into a career of sort of civic engagement, engaging in elections, engaging in advocacy for or against policies that I care about. And I also spent a lot of time reading and thinking about this. If you come into my house, you find 2 kinds of books. You find political books and you find cookbooks. And so basically that's where we are today. So I wanted just to open up, and I'm talking fast, I apologize, but I want to give just a little bit of context to what we're trying to do before I turn to your colleagues, which is sort of what is the realm of civic engagement. And I think that, when we think about JCPA and sort of the local JCRCs, we think about community relations. I'm going to sort of just put out there that when I think about civic engagement, there's definitely overlap, but I think about 3 specific realms. I, number one, think about sort of the public awareness and sort of public education realm. That's part and parcel of what the JCRCs do all the time, right? Educating both our community about issues, educating other communities about our issues, and working collaboratively on a set of issues around democracy and pluralism and social issues that are on the agenda. I then think about advocacy, and specifically advocacy meaning for or against public policy and stances, right? Whether you're advocating for a piece of legislation, whether you're advocating against sort of an executive policy, whatever that may be, but literally the act of getting people, what I like to call demonstrating constituency, so that a decision maker would know who is for or against something. And the third realm of civic engagement is what I think of as the electoral realm. And I know I've had some conversations with different people around this time. I think sort of the concept of 501c3s participating in elections, might be a little bit sort of, make people feel a little squeamish at times. But let me say that education in the context of an election and how people recognize, where a politician stands or where a decision maker, potential elected stands on a particular issue, or having them understand where a community stands is absolutely in the realm of 501c3 activity. Advocating for those people to win or lose is not, but advocating stances and understanding where they stand absolutely is. And I think that when we talk about civic engagement today, and we ultimately ask you to do some of these exercises, thinking about how can you engage in all of these pieces across the board is really important. I'll then also say that, as I was listening to that last session on waging democracy, and Vanita, sort of talked about, how important it is for people to engage, but also how difficult it is. I think this is really important, and so I want to address a couple of things before I turn over. Number one, we are living in a very, very polarized time, and I think that this makes it difficult for more and more people sometimes to engage. We're seeing both sort of a rise of lots of people getting involved who are kind of doing resistance politics, but it also makes people want to not engage on the other side and sort of stay out of it. And so I think we all need to think about how do we actually embrace and bring more people into the process in that context. I also think that trying to educate people about all of the issues that are out there is actually something that's really important. Making sure that people have a good understanding of of our issues and of the issues that are on the other side, and that a lot of people, there's a lot more organizations out there. There's a lot more issues. It is a lot harder to break through, and so there needs to be some understanding of the landscape and how do we engage and how do we engage appropriately with other organizations. And I know that people in this room are really experts on building coalitions, but I'm going to challenge people in this room to go even deeper and farther, because I think that that is sort of the core of the work we do, and I think that it's harder to do today, but it's even more important than ever. And I wanted to point out before I stop, I promise I'll be short, I've been reading this book called You're More Powerful Than You Think You Are. It's by Eric Liu. I highly recommend it to people, and he also does TED Talks, so you can just find him online. But he talks about 3 different ways to act in the back on strategies, and I sort of wanted to point those out today because I think they're really sort of beacons for what we need to do, and sort of emphasize some of the other pieces that have been happening. One is that we need to act exponentially. Right? The things that we do and the way that we act in community needs to amplify the work and make sure that we are greater than the sum of our parts. And that means that the coalitions need to be more real and they need to be more expansive, and we need to find ways to work with people more collaboratively. The second thing that we need to talk about is acting reciprocally. And what does that mean? That sometimes we're in it with other organizations on their issues, because we need to be, and it's ultimately going to come back to us, but it may not seem obvious at first. And I think that's sometimes hard, especially for newer people to engage in, and I think that's something we all need to think about. How do we do that? How do we do that authentically? And the third strategy he suggests for that is deep cooperation. And I think, the lead up to this session here has been a lot about that, and how do we talk about that, and how do we work with other organizations. But I think really thinking about what deep, meaningful cooperation means is a really good beacon to think about in this context. So I'm going to stop there and turn to our panel. We've got 3 amazing people. We've got Diane from Silicon Valley, and Jeremy from Boston, and Batya, formerly of DC, but now Philadelphia. And we're going to ask them to talk for a few minutes about the work that they've been doing in their communities and how this touches on those 3 realms of engagement. We're going to have them go through sort of just in a row some quick anecdotes and sort of descriptions, and then we'll do a few questions, including Q&A from you all. So Diane.
Okay, I wanted to start with a shout out to all of my colleagues in the communities out there that are single staff shops or 2-person shops, small boards or small communities. And I like the title of that, You Are More Powerful Than You Think. All of us should do this work, but particularly I want to encourage folks like our smaller communities to really know that this is your best way to be powerful, to build coalitions, is to do the civic engagement work. Yeah, so I want to connect the dots between 2 of your examples, 2 categories, the education category and the electoral season categories, and then I'm going to wrap with a really nice outcome for our community from doing this work. The first piece I want to highlight has been talked about here today, voting rights, right? And it was really great to have that topic raised here. And then also when the Shelby County v. Holder decision started to really impact our voting rights, we had David Saperstein here at JCPA who really taught us a lot about the impact of that. So we took a page from that education and held a voting rights Passover Seder with our African American Community Services Agency in San Jose. That was the first time we ever had a Seder in that space. We had a rabbi and a black pastor lead it. The pastor had a great singing voice, which really rocked the house with a lot of good music. And if anybody would like a copy of that Haggadah that I wrote, I would be really more than happy to share that with you. I want to link in another little piece of relationship building. Our JCRC was one of the 5 communities that received a mini grant from Israel Action Network to work on African American Jewish partnership. And in particular, out of that work, we built a relationship with the black sororities in our community. And that is a really great group to work with. They are a strongly organized group that is a lifetime commitment to education and civic engagement in the black community. And that's a piece where we can build a good coalition. So then I want to skip to the election season piece and the comment that was made earlier about school board and starting with relationships there. So this last election season, we did just a reception for school board candidates. The JCRC invited all of the people running in Santa Clara County for school board. Again, we went back to the African American Community Service Agency, and the black sororities brought out all the people. They brought the voting registration forms, and it's a simple event, again, that anyone can put together. But it's a very powerful thing. You're starting with people, you're sort of building your farm team with folks that you're going to follow through their career, right? And it's kind of a more authentic relationship because they can say, you knew them when, before they really advanced their careers and went through, where they probably will continue to go. In other elected positions. So the outcome piece that I just want to highlight is from that event, one of the unsuccessful school board candidates and one of the board members of the African American Community Service Agency ended up being on the San Jose Women's March Committee. And those women really felt themselves to be allies with the community because we had done all this civic engagement and education work together, right? And so when those difficult conversations arose about should we in San Jose stand against not in relation to the National Women's March, should we openly speak about anti-Semitism in the movement? Those were difficult conversations, but the fact that those 2 women who were not the Jewish speakers in the room could stand up and be allies of the Jewish community. And then I want to give a shout out to Ava Lippman, our co-chair, who was also part of that conversation. Between those relationships and her participation, we had a really nice outcome in San Jose. I can be sort of proud to say that the opening rally of our San Jose Women's March, that the co-chair of the march openly stated that hate is not welcome in San Jose, that anti-Semitism is not welcome in our community, and that outcome was really due to all of this civic engagement and education that we shared with each other.
Hey, Jeremy, turn to you.
So our story comes out of a shift, or actually an evolution, out of legislative policy advocacy into other forms of community engagement through our own internal education on issues of immigrants and refugees in Massachusetts. And for like so many JCRCs, we have been part of a policy advocacy coalition on immigration issues going back decades in Massachusetts, advocating for state house legislation, both on the human service side and policy side, supporting immigrants in Massachusetts. And the week after the inauguration, we actually had the head of that coalition and some of our other immigrant partners meeting with our board. And we had this real moment of clarity that it's one thing to be able to make statements or continue to say the state should do this, and frankly in Massachusetts to tell our congressional delegation you should be supporting immigrants and refugees is not exactly a powerful transformative impact in Washington. And understanding that we felt frankly powerless in the Washington conversation as a blue state JCRC with a hyper blue state congressional delegation, we began to ask the question, where do we actually have the power to have an impact? And one of the quick realizations to us around education and engaging with some of our immigrant neighbors, not just as a coalition on advocacy, but as neighbors who were struggling and had real fear about what was coming for them and their families, was the recognition essentially that the border is not just in Texas or California. The border is anywhere there's a port of entry. And the crisis of immigrants and ICE isn't just in those states along the southern border. The crisis is anywhere that immigrants go once they are in the country, once they've been granted the opportunity to wait asylum hearings, once they've been granted temporary status, whatever that is, including for hundreds of thousands of them in New England. And so we started to also educate ourselves about what could individual parts of the Jewish community do. Things that felt right for one institution or organization might not be right for another organization in our community. And to engage in a conversation about we ought to at least do something. Not just make a statement from 35 Jewish organizations in Greater Boston that appeared on the front page of the Boston Globe a week after the election about standing with immigrants and refugees, but actually doing something that's practical work. And so we began to shift our 20 years of synagogue organizing from the historical model of it's about building coalitions of synagogues and churches on policy change issues, and we're very proud of those policy change issues, like, for example, was shouted out the other morning by my predecessor, Romney Care, to what do they actually do as synagogues, what do we actually do as Jewish institutions to support our immigrant neighbors and to help them. And where we've ended up over the last 2 years is we've built in partnership mostly with the Episcopalian Diocese and the Unitarian Universalist Church in Massachusetts, but with many other partners, something called the Boston Immigrant Justice Accompaniment Network. And we have invited synagogues, churches, others into a wide variety of ways to support our neighbors. And this has been both a what you can do and also to engage in direct relationship. So we have over 700 volunteers now in this network, of whom about 45% are Jewish. We have 18 synagogues participating in 4 sanctuary networks that are hosting families. Sanctuary networks have a level A, which is the actual church which a family is living in, and level B, commitments of volunteers, and level C is commitments of other resources. We have 18 synagogues at level B and C in these 4 networks, and they've been hosting families for over a year who are hiding in basements, out of fear of deportation. We've accompanied over 250 immigrants to their hearings. We've raised over $200,000 to bond out immigrants from ICE detention centers. And bonding out means people who have been granted the right to an asylum hearing, but now just need to come up with like $5,000 or $10,000 so they can wait for 1, 2, 5 years until they actually get that hearing. We provided pro bono lawyers, and we've had families hosting people who get out of detention, who don't have a place to go, but need to have a sponsor. There are 30 households, of which 75% are Jewish households, hosting immigrants in their homes while they're waiting their asylum hearings. And each one of these things, some congregations have been a rabbi saying, I'm going to go and do pastoral work at the ICE detention center in Burlington. But we're not going to take on sanctuary because the board, it's all kinds of legal, like blah, 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 blah. And others have been like, no, we're going to be in the sanctuary network because it's the same coalition of churches in our town that we've been with on healthcare or environmental issues in our community. And in other cases, it's always been a what can we do? Where do we have power to make an impact, even if it's only for one family? And then it leads back around to advocacy. Because as we've done more and more of this work, and as more and more members of our community and other communities are in relationship directly with immigrant and refugee families, we've also recognized that while there is a level of this that is about federal policy, there are things that states can do and have not done enough of, whether that is, frankly, state law, which we, despite our claims to be a city on the hill for the nation and the hub of the universe and all that stuff, we do not have state law that essentially prevents local law enforcement from working with ICE. So that's totally a choice that is being made by individual DAs, by individual judges, by individual sheriffs in Massachusetts. We were not successful in getting that law passed in that last session, and we're going to continue working on it. There's work to be done on driver's license so that these people who are bonded out and are working for years, waiting for years, that they can have the kinds of documentation that enable them to do certain kinds of jobs, like drive. And so there's a lot of work to do on that, but what it's done is we've gone from a model of legislative advocacy to learning to engagement, and then back around to legislative advocacy in a way that we understand we actually can be powerful at a state level.
It's amazing, thanks. Right, Batya.
Good morning. I'm actually here this morning because, and I want to acknowledge and wish condolences and send my love to Gila Franklin-Siegel, the Assistant Director of the JCRC of Greater Washington. Her father died this week, and the staff of that JCRC is at the funeral. So So I'm here representing the JCRC of Greater Washington, even though I'm the director of the JCRC of Greater Philadelphia. And so Laurie's asked me to share the tale of the DC council member who thought the Jews controlled the weather and posted it on Facebook. Yeah. So, and the truth is that was everybody's first reaction, because how can it not be? And he really did think that. Probably, I don't know if he still does. But, so we're now faced with a situation, while to some degree ridiculous, is a great concern. When a member of the DC Council is sharing classic anti-Semitic tropes and of that level publicly, it becomes a real concern for the community, no matter how silly it is. And this is really the story of how do we work to be clear that this is entirely unacceptable, to be clear that the DC Council rejects this kind of language, these ideas, and rejects anti-Semitism in every way, without letting this become portrayed as the African American community versus the Jewish community, which is the easy narrative. And as most people are aware, DC is a very segregated city, with a tremendous range in between the very, very poor, generally African American communities in Ward 7 and 8, and the very different demographic in the rest of the city. So the need to control this as quickly as possible so it did not become something that would poison the relationship between communities for decades to come was readily apparent. It's also the tale of how when you're dealing with people, you need to contact them personally and remember who they are. You're not dealing with the idea of a council member or the idea of a rabbi. You're talking to people with their own concerns and their own fears and their own agendas. So I called the council member's office and said, I'd like to come and talk. And he said yes, because he had realized that he had walked into something he really had no understanding about. And before I had even gotten there for that afternoon's meeting, I got a phone call from the chair of the DC Council who asked if he could come with me. So now the DC Council chair is asking to come with me to my meeting with his council member. And because he was really very pained and disturbed that this was an issue that had come up within his council in a way that he found personally very disturbing. The council chair is not Jewish, but his father was Jewish or of Jewish descent, and this was very meaningful to him personally. It was very upsetting. So when we met together with the council member, it became very clear he really had no understanding of what had happened or how to handle it. He was very anxious to move forward and put it behind him. And the DC Council chair was very anxious for him to understand what had happened and that it was completely unacceptable and how can the DC Council move forward. So that same day we were able to agree on having a breakfast where the Jewish community could come together and share their concerns with the DC Council. So, and it was a very powerful breakfast. I spent the next several days, we figured it would take at least a week to get breakfast together, and I spent that week talking rabbis down. There was a great deal of concern, in many cases anger, from very liberal rabbis, in many cases, who had worked all their lives on racial justice issues, who were very upset to find this kind of racist rhetoric from one of their council members. And I have spent a lot of time reassuring people he's actually not a rabid anti-Semitism. He simply is clueless. And this is something we've heard also. We need to understand that if you grow up in an African American community where you have no idea of what actual Jews are like, you have to understand there are going to be ideas out there that are truly disturbing. it needs to be clear, he really does think a lot of things that are truly objectionable, but it's not a sense of the Jews are evil, he just has no clue. And I spent a lot of time explaining to the rabbis, the council absolutely is concerned and wants to meet and hear from the Jewish community. And Councilmember White is actually not evil. And throughout the entire saga, the press shared bits of information one by one that made it absolutely impossible to have a sense that we had moved on to a conclusion. And shortly after that first Facebook video, there was, the press found a video of a public event with the DC Council and the mayor present where Trayvon White shared the same idea. And if you look, most people, they really weren't paying much attention, and like the mayor looks confused. Nobody challenges him because it's too weird. Right? But they're horrified, like the Jewish council members in that meeting, like, why didn't I say something? They couldn't even imagine it. They just weren't paying enough attention. Right? So just when you think it's an isolated event, there's another piece of information that it's not. Right? We get everyone in the room, and they have breakfast together, and the DC council members, first of all, the rabbis actually agreed to what questions were going to be asked and who was going to ask them. And even though a couple of rabbis came in and totally ignored that and said whatever they wanted, it didn't seem that way. Like, we seemed very organized, and we seemed like we were coming together with a common concern. But to hear the council members and the DC council share their personal pain, both the Jewish and the non-Jewish council members, and those non-Jewish council members who had family members who were Jewish, to share their concern was very powerful. And there was an agreement that they would add, they have a resolution opposing bigotry and racism, and they realized anti-Semitism isn't on the list. They agreed that they would address that. We brought in the regional director of ADL, who would come in and he gave an explanation, what is anti-Semitism? Because we know what it is, but they don't even know when they see it. So that 10-minute, the saga. All right, so we were able to work with ADL, who came in to educate the council. We worked with the Jews United for Justice, because they had actual connections in Ward 8 and Ward 7 and with the African American community, so they would know more people. And we were able to come together as a community, and if you would like to hear how it all played out and the nightmare it turned out to be, I'd be happy to talk to you about it later.
All right, we may get to that yet. Let's ask a couple of quick questions here. So we heard three really different approaches of situations and engagements in the community. I just want to ask Diane first. Have you all continued to sort of engage with local electeds and sort of both at the local level and do you have new members of Congress in your area, and how is your JCRC sort of continuing to work with them beyond sort of say the Women's March, which is
Right. So we are really very focused locally. We have wonderful members of Congress also that we interact with, but I'll just call out that after the election, we also had a really fun post-election Diwali Hanukkah party, and to that we invited all the people that were successfully elected to our local town councils and county board of supervisors and so forth, and gave each of them a moment to just give their elevator speech about what they're looking forward to in their new term. So I think it's really for us a local focus, and B, always connecting your intergroup relations work with your civic engagement work, because it's just more interesting to people. People are feel much more compelled to come to that kind of event when they're seeing people working together, your elected officials and your voting public.
Right, and then Jeremy, so your story was amazing, and the numbers of people that you had involved were unbelievable. Can you just talk briefly about how did you get to a number where that many people were actively engaging in this? Because it seems like it really has sort of been widespread, and that's and it's hard to do, right, is to build that sort of huge cadre of people who want to get involved in an issue like that.
Well, I appreciate that. I think to make it more accessible to people is that it's not about the large numbers, it's the large numbers of organizations, institutions, and synagogues. We just happen to be a larger community. So it might be a synagogue in which 5 people have taken this on in that congregation. We just happen to have 130 synagogues in our catchment area. So in a smaller community where if you have 10 synagogues, how can you get 5 of those synagogues for 5 people each? And it might only be 25 people. The point is that we were trying to create a whole bunch of different ways to engage with this question of what is our responsibility to our immigrant and refugee neighbors. And for some people, it made sense to be like, I'm going to donate dollars. And you're in a large city, and our federation was able to capitalize on this campaign $1 million to pay for lawyers for the immigrants in our community. That's not going to be the right answer for every community. But can you do a campaign that raises $10,000 for a local, legal aid group? Can you do each synagogue in an area take on one thing? And one thing leads to 2, and 2 things leads to 10.
Right. Batya, I don't want to leave people totally hanging on this story because it is sort of an amazing, unbelievable story. So why don't we just tell sort of maybe the part where the museum, and maybe if you could sort of wrap up a little bit of, what comes next after sort of a situation like this.
So one of the responses was an agreement with the council member to go and visit the Holocaust Museum. And he really wanted to do this. Like, he absolutely wanted to do this, like, tomorrow. He's like, great, I can go tomorrow. I'm like, not tomorrow. we need to arrange a tour for you. We're going to need to make sure this is a well-programmed visit. Really not tomorrow. Well, okay, but whenever you want me there. So we contact the person at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum who works with government officials. She's going to arrange a tour. And then I wait to hear back about what happens. What I find out is from a text from the council member, and this is a very young man who deals in texts, right? Which means that you don't know who else is being contacted, you don't know who on his staff you should be talking to, you don't even know if his staff knows what's going on. But 7 o'clock in the morning, 11 o'clock at night, I'm getting text from the council member. He wants to check in about the Holocaust visit that we're going on in 2 days. I'm like, what are you talking about? Because somehow I have been left off that email chain about when that visit was arranged. I'm like, okay, we're going in 2 days. How about if I stop by and we talk about what that visit's going to be like? The council member did not know how to ask the question. Like, he did not know that he should get a little preparation, and I did not understand how little he understood. One of the things I talked about was after that visit, we need to set up a meeting with the Washington Post. They're going to cover this. We need to help them. We need to control this in a way where you will get a chance to represent yourself. Councilmember White is from Ward 8. He understands himself to be under attack the way Marion Barry was under attack. The man didn't take a fork to the first breakfast, so he just sat there and didn't eat because he didn't want to get up and get a fork. And the press covered that as he just sat there and didn't eat. Right? He was trying to be respectful. Right? The next time there was a breakfast, they reported he just ate. It's not like he's really confused about this. He doesn't seem to be able to win. And he refuses to do anything with the press. He says, absolutely no press. No, I want this to be personally meaningful, no press, no press, no press. So we go to the museum in the middle of the day. He closes his office and brings his entire staff because this is meaningful to him. The museum has arranged for an African-American guide. And we have found out the Washington Post knows about this visit. Councilmember White knows the Washington Post knows about this visit. And we go through the museum, and suddenly I have a Washington Post reporter standing by my elbow. And I get away from this as fast Right? I did not bring you here. You are not with me. We are not part of this discussion with you. And I walk up to stand with the council member staff, and we go through the museum. And this guy's been there for a while already. And the council member suddenly is gone. Right? We can't find him. His staff doesn't know where he is. We're walking through the museum on this tour, and I'm chatting with his staff. Where's the council member? Is he in the bathroom? Did he have to go to a meeting in his ward? Oh, we think he had to go to a meeting in his ward. Then the Post reporter's reporting all this, and he's like texting, I'm like, where are you? And it's like, I'm waiting in the lobby. Why are you waiting in the lobby? Right. We get out of the museum. The Post reporter manages to find him as he's getting into a cab, because he's been there the whole time. Because he was trying, like all the man had to do was walk through the museum and say that was very powerful. I've learned so much. But he manages to do the worst possible thing and leave without comment. And then the reporter finds him as he's getting into his car, and the reporter has asked me to wait to speak to him later. And he refuses to answer questions. The reporter asks him questions, and he just is talking on his phone, trying to ignore a Washington Post reporter. And then he asks, so what can you tell me about your donation to Farragut? And Councilmember White ignores him and gets in the car. The reporter comes back to find me and says, can you share your thoughts about why the council member left? And I'm pretty sure he left because he didn't want to talk to a reporter, but it's not my job. I can't defend the guy. He's got to do it himself. He had his chance. I have to speak for the Jewish community. And I say, I'm so confused. I don't know. I don't want to condemn him, but I can't defend him. Like, that was a terrible idea. I'm really confused. And then he asked me, have you heard about this donation to Farragut, and would you like to share your thoughts? And I have not heard about it. I would have to understand it better. And then we have an off-the-record conversation where I find out they're going to be putting out a story, probably not in the same story, probably a couple of days later, about a donation from his constituents fund to a Farragut dinner. And so now I'm left dealing with understanding he hasn't defended himself, and we're going to have to deal with him on this level. He can't manage to get out a statement in time, despite JOJ showing up to help him write one. And we're left with this terrible situation, despite everyone's best efforts. And I know JCRC GW is continuing the dialogue with council and local Black ministers.
All right, sorry, I know that was a longer story, but so many lessons.
Sorry.
No, but so many lessons there, in terms of thinking about who's in office and how do you get to them early, right, to sort of start to have these dialogues, because as Batya so rightly points out, you don't know what people don't know. Lessons about how do you interact with the press, and obviously Washington, a little bit bigger city, but this was people were looking to make this an issue, and so of course the Post was going to come into the game, because we have a giant metro section here. So all of these things, when you think about civic engagement and how do you engage in your community and with different, both electeds but also people in the community and the Jewish community who wanted to, go after this guy immediately. How do you manage both your own and the outside? I think are all ways to think about, how do we deal with these really sort of hot button situations that, quite frankly, if you even think about the last few days, take up so much time and energy from our community, from the work that we want to do, that is really building these long-term relationships, right? So that when something happens, we have a base from which to approach it and to sort of engage. So here's what we're going to try and do. I apologize, we're going to not be able to do quick audience questions, but we're going to come back later together. We're going to break people up and do a quick exercise together. So for those of you sitting at tables, you can actually mostly stay where you are. The folks here in the room, I'm going to ask you to join a table. We've got 7 people who are facilitating. So can the facilitators just raise their hand? So we've got, folks here are going to join tables back there. We've got 7 different tables, all right? So we've got Doug, we've got Lindsay in the back of the room, we've got Tammy.
So please just bring chairs.